The desert night was holding its breath when they took her, a moonless stretch of silence broken only by the scuff of boots and the soft snort of frightened horses, and no one in that outlaw gang understood the line they had just crossed, because they thought an Apache woman alone meant unguarded, unclaimed, forgotten by the world, and they were wrong in a way men only realize when it is already too late, because the woman they dragged from the firelight quiet, proud, eyes steady as a mountain pool was named Nalin, and she carried a story older than the dust, a promise bound not by rings or papers but by blood and debt, and a bond forged in smoke and thunder years earlier when a wounded gunslinger had collapsed near her, People's Canyon with a bullet in his side and death in his breath, and while the men argued whether to finish him, Nalin had knelt, cut the lead free with a blade older than the map of the territory, packed the wound with bitter herbs, and said simply, "Live," and the man had lived, and when he woke he learned her name and the law of her people, that a life saved becomes a life bound, and he had nodded because he understood debts, because he was Silas Crow, once called the fastest hand from the Pecos to the San Juan, the man who put down 6 killers before breakfast and then walked away from the sound of his own legend, and when he left that canyon he left a promise, nailed to the wine no harm would come to Nalin while his shadow still touched the ground. The outlaws who took her that night did not know this, did not know that the desert itself would carry the news faster than their horses, because Nalin did not scream, and that was the first mistake. She watched and counted and waited, marking faces by the way they breathed, listening to names spill careless from their mouths, and before dawn the wind shifted and carried her name, like a spark to a line shack to ridges away where Silas Crow sat oiling a revolver he swore he would never draw again. And he paused because some sounds are felt rather than heard, and he stood because some debts do not rust, and he saddled a horse that had known gunfire and long miles, and he rode without hurry, because hurry wastes bullets, and by the time the sky began to pale the color of bone, Silas Crow was already at the fence of the outlaw camp, a simple wire strung between mesquite posts, and the first man who looked up saw him and laughed until the laugh fell apart, because Crow stood easy, coat unbuttoned, hat low, eyes like winter, and he spoke once, softly, let her walk, and the camp erupted in bravado because men are loud when they are afraid, and Crow sighed because he had hoped, because he was tired, because legends are heavy things to carry, and then the sun edged the horizon, and the first shot came not from Crow but from a nervous hand that twitched, and the desert answered with thunder as Crow moved, and the stories always say it happened fast, and that is true and also not true, because in those seconds there was time enough for regret, time enough for the fence to sing as bullets cut wire, time enough for the ground to remember old violence, and when the smoke thinned 3 men lay still, 2 more fled into a wash that would swallow them, and the last man dropped his gun and wept, and Crow kicked the weapon away and said, "You don't get to die today," and he cut Nalin's bonds with the same blade she had once used on him, and she stood without shaking, brushing dust from her sleeves, meeting his eyes as equals, and there was no embrace because some gratitude is too deep for display, and together they walked out of the camp while the sun lifted like a promise kept, and Crow set the fence right before he left because he believed in mending what you break, and when they reached the edge of the canyon he stopped, knowing this was where paths divide, and Nalin placed a small stone in his palm, smooth and warm, and said, "The debt is balanced," and he closed his fingers and said, "It always will be," and then he turned his horse toward the long road, a man stepping back into the dust with a little less weight on his shoulders, while behind him the canyon woke to birds and light and the knowledge that some lines should never be crossed, and if this story stirred you, if you felt the sunrise and the reckoning and the quiet strength that outlasts violence, then ride with us again by subscribing to Wild West Dairies, where legends are told with heart, honor, and the truth that the West remembers everything.